Today at the National Press Club, the United Nations Special Rapporteur for Palestinian Human Rights, Francesca Albanese. She'll outline why previous approaches in Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories have failed as the conflict enters a sixth week. Francesca Albanese with today's National Press Club address.
Hello and welcome to the National Press Club and today's Westpac address. We're coming to you from Ngunnawal and Ngambia country. My name is Tom Connell. I'm an anchor at Sky News and also the treasurer here at the club. Our guest today is Francesca Albanese. That's the only time I'll attempt the Italian today, I think. She's the UN Special Rapporteur for the occupied Palestinian territory, and with her address to the National Press Club of Australia entitled Israel and the Occupied Palestinian Territory, the Story You Choose to Tell. Francesca is a distinguished human rights lawyer with more than 2 decades of experience at the United Nations, including roles with the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights and the Relief and Work Agency for Palestine Refugees. Appointed as the Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in the Palestinian territories by the UN Human Rights Council in 2022, Ms Albanese is renowned for her expertise in enforcing human rights norms, particularly for vulnerable groups such as refugees and migrants across the Middle East, North Africa and Asia Pacific as well. She also co-founded the Global Network on the Question of Palestine, uniting professionals and scholars working on Israel-Palestine. She has a rich background teaching international law and forced displacement in European and Arab universities. The address comes obviously as a political debate intensifies in Australia about Israel's right to defend itself and the plight of Palestinian civilians. One protest, of course, turning violent in Melbourne as our political leaders have urged calm in Australia. You can follow the conversation at Press Club Ost or hashtag NPC. Please welcome Francesca Albanese.
Yuma. Hello everyone, and I wish to express my gratitude to the Australian Friends of Palestine and the Australia-Palestine Advocacy Network for inviting me to Australia months ago, before the inferno that has enveloped Gaza started and could be foreseen. And they invited me to meet with a variety of communities, constituencies, I would say people of conscience, mostly, on unceded First Nations land. I pay tribute to the traditional custodians of the land where we are meeting today, and as a visitor to this country, but also as someone from the continent where colonialism originates as a method of control, resource exploitation and subjugation of the natives, it's particularly relevant for me to be here in my position as a Special Rapporteur on the occupied Palestinian territory. And it is so moving for me to be able to pay my respects to the elders, past and present, and extend that respect to all other First Nations people present or watching. The indigenous people in these countries, as elsewhere across the world, cannot and have never ceded sovereignty. And as I say that, my heart goes out to Palestine, where the indigenous Palestinians, or what remains of them since the majority were ethnically cleansed in 1947-1949 from what is modern-day Israel, and in 1967 from the territory that for 56 years Israel has militarily occupied the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and the Gaza Strip. The Palestinians under occupation are fighting today an existential struggle not to be forcibly displaced from or fatally subjugated in the little that remains of their historical homeland. In fact, it is correct to say that the indigenous Palestinians have been progressively ethnically cleansed as of 1947. For those who are not familiar with it, my mandate entails monitoring and reporting to the United Nations on violations of international law committed in the Palestinian territory that Israel occupies. This position is honorary, though very demanding, as you can see, and this is a position that I'm proud to serve as the 8th and first woman in the 30-year history of this mandate. The toughest part of this is being exposed to endless suffering, where people are too easily killed, blamed and smeared, as my new friend Nasser Mashni said yesterday while he was in front of an execution squad. You did very well, Nasser. And this is the Australian people you proudly say you belong to, applauding you. And you Palestinians are always questioned, second-guessed, misinterpreted, and defamed. As an independent expert, my focus is on conducting investigations of violation of international law, particularly human rights violation. I made a point since the very beginning of my mandate. I have a people-centered approach, and although traditionally this mandate looked at violations committed by Israel, have made a point that I look at all perpetrators, all violators of international law, including the Palestinian Authority and the de facto authority in Gaza. And I'm committed to observe the strictest standards of objectivity and impartiality. This means examining facts, all facts reported to me. As for those of you who do not know, I'm not allowed to visit the occupied Palestinian territory, although I'm mandated to do so by the United Nations because Israel prevents me from doing so. So I examined the facts reported to me and observed, and I analyzed them against the applicable international legal framework, humanitarian law, law of war, international human rights law, and other relevant instruments. And once I've made my analysis and come to the conclusion that international law violations have been committed, my task is not to create a balance or to be impartial between the victims and the perpetrators. My job is to insist on measures to restore legality, to undo justice, and to prevent further abuses and injustice. If the state in question cooperates, this can be dealt with easily and discreetly, but when the state authorities refuse to engage in constructive dialogues and in fact continue to blatantly violate international law, then at the risk of making myself unpopular, as my colleague and former Special Rapporteur on Torture, Niels Milzer, used to say, we have a duty to engage with the larger public and appeal to a broader public. Anything less would make me personally betray my mandate. Across this visit, which as I said, had been planned for months, I was prepared to discuss my findings through 16 months as a Special Rapporteur, which culminated in 3 reports. One focuses on the right of self-determination, another one on arbitrary deprivation of liberty, which mostly happens behind bars, but also beyond bars, and I can elaborate on that, and children. But since the beginning of my term as a Special Rapporteur and the years that preceded it, the realities in the occupied Palestinian territory have evolved as a troubling one, which could explode at any moment. For example, in 16 months of mandate, I've documented and reported the killing of 60 Israelis and 460 Palestinians. This was not normal. And I'm saying that to those in this country who still think or behave as they really believe that the war, whatever they call war, started on the 7th of October. And again, this has been the most lethal year for the Palestinians after last year which was already the most lethal in 20 years. And yet, the tragic hours we are living and the ground zero of humanity that we have been thrown into since the 7th of October obliged me to start from there. Since October the 7th, 13,000 people have been killed in Israel and the occupied Palestinian territory, mostly Gaza. I have extended and continue to extend my deepest condolences to all individuals and communities directly affected, and to the many across the world who are suffering with them. And I particularly direct this message of sorrow and solidarity to the Palestinian and Jewish communities in Australia. On October 7, approximately 1,200 Israelis and foreign nationals were killed and approximately 5,000 injured in Israel following attacks by Hamas from the occupied Gaza Strip. These are war crimes and must be accounted for. And in reaction, and claiming a non-existent right to self-defense under the UN Charter, Israel has embarked on an unrelenting bombardment of Gaza that has entered its 38th day and has killed over 11,078 people, 4,506 of whom are children. And let me be very frank, we don't know when we will know all the others who have been killed after yesterday, because the Ministry of Health doesn't have the capacity to count the death anymore. The carpet bombing of Gaza has also injured almost 30,000 people and displaced 1.5 million, more than a half of the population. And I should have said from the beginning that half of the people in the occupied Palestinian territory, half of the Palestinians, are under 18. 40% of them are not even 15. Half of the population in the Gaza Strip is made of children. 2,700 Palestinians, as we speak, are still under the rubble, gasping for air, in need of rescue, medical attention, or burial. That will not come. They will likely perish there, as there are no means to rescue them. And among those killed, there are hundreds of medical personnel and humanitarian officers and dozens of journalists. With over 100, I think it's 192 now, UN officers killed. This has been the most lethal conflict in the history of the United Nations. Around them, 50% of housing units in Gaza have been totally or partially destroyed. Hospitals, schools, mosques, churches, cultural centers, and universities have all been bombed, with entire neighborhoods leveled to the ground. Immediately following the events of October 7, Israel has tightened the 16-year-old unlawful blockade, preventing the entry into Gaza of all life-sustaining supplies, including food, water, medical supplies, and fuel. Humanitarian aid has become a tool of war, exposing the population to the inescapable risk of death. War crimes, crimes against humanity, must be accounted for, but also must be prevented. Together with other special rapporteurs have warned already 3 weeks ago against the risk that Israel might commit the crime of genocide against the Palestinian people, as genocide is the intentional targeting of a population based on racial, national, ethnic, or religious lines with intent to destroy it in all or in part. And certainly, the statements made by Israeli politicians and military unveil a genocidal intent to wipe out Gaza and its residents, and this should not be ignored. But also because as of the 7th of October, in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, where Hamas has no authority or military presence, Israeli soldiers and armed settlers have been terrorizing Palestinian communities, killing over 172 Palestinians, including 46 children, injuring 2,500, forcibly displacing 15 herding communities, and depopulating 11 villages in the South Hebron Hills and Jordan Valley. So in the past day, the Israeli occupation forces have carried out heavily armed incursions by ground and air into densely populated refugee camps. Jenin refugee camp has been bombed over and over this year by ground and air forces again. Flyers threatening the Palestinians to leave the land toward Jordan have also been distributed across the West Bank. And in the face of all this, the international community is almost completely paralyzed. I'm being generous when I say almost. With the UN experiencing its most epic political and humanitarian failure since its creation. Individual member states, especially in the West, and Australia is no exception, are on the margins, muttering inaudible words of condemnations for Israel's excesses at best, or staying silent in fear of restraining Israel's self-proclaimed right to self-defend, whatever it means. So here's where we are, staring into the abyss. While the Palestinians face the most significant existential threat, and in a different way, the Israelis, especially Israeli Jews as well, as a society informed by human values that are getting lost, as the country gets enveloped in genocidal crisis. The wholesale destruction of Gaza will force many to leave, even when the hostilities end. And the unrestrained ferocity of settlers in the West Bank and East Jerusalem will sooner or later push vulnerable Palestinians to leave. And if in 75 years' time the international community has still to realize what the Nakba is, here is what it is, televised, under our watch. The current reality epitomizes how the international community has so epically failed to promote peace and security for both Palestinians and Israelis, premised upon international law and the end of Israel's 56-year-old occupation, and the realization of Palestinian self-determination and freedom. Israel's government and its supporters have spun narratives that portray the Palestinians as an existential threat to the Jewish people and the Palestinian struggle for basic rights as a direct challenge to Israel's very existence. And let me say, many of these tropes resonate so strongly in this country as well. And unconscionably, this is also harming the Jews around the world, the Jews in Australia as well, who might find themselves targeted because they are associated as Jews to the actions of Israel. Correcting this requires a rehumanization of the discourse itself. And I'm so happy to speak to journalists because you have a great deal of homework to do in this respect. And this is what I like of the Australian people. First of all, you get my sense of humor, but also you take criticism well. So, yeah. In the interest of both Palestinians, and I'm saying this in the interest of both Palestinians and Israelis, Israeli Jews. But how do we rehumanize the discourse? I ask myself. In an attempt to contribute to rehumanizing the narrative of the discourse, I devoted my last report to children. Because over and above the sterility of numbers, I keep on reminding everyone what I said before. Half of the Palestinian population under martial rule is made of children. And no one has been victimized by Israel's settler colonial rule more than Palestinian children throughout generations. While all children across the occupied Palestinian territory are rendered vulnerable, it is the Palestinian... While all Palestinians across the Palestinian territory have been rendered vulnerable, it is the Palestinian children who are most disproportionately impacted, tormented beyond what their tender age can bear. Israel justifies its use of force against them by presenting the entire Palestinian collective as inherently terrorist and as an existential threat to Israel and the Jewish people. This is not only incredibly dehumanizing and racist, it also unchilds the children, taking away the lightness of childhood and robbing them of their future. Since 1967, over 1 million Palestinians, nearly 1 million Palestinians, including children as young as 12, have been arrested and detained under authoritarian rules, military orders, which are drafted, enacted, enforced, and adjudicated by soldiers in military courts. Imagine children appearing before military courts. Palestinians under occupation have been subject and in fact under military rule or colonial emergency rule, which only apply to them, while Israelis living in settlements are under Israeli civil law. Under this military order, which I carefully examined and described in my second report, Palestinians are often arrested and subject to long detention for the simplest acts of life and the exercise of fundamental human rights, like expressing opinions, gathering, pronouncing political speeches unauthorized by the Israeli occupation forces, or even merely attempting to do so. My favorite one is participating in a gathering of 10 or more people, can be a vigil, can be a protest, can be a wedding, which is not authorized by the army, might lead to 10 years in jail. And this is not even the most serious. So Palestinians are ultimately deprived of their status of protected persons under occupation. They are often presumed guilty without evidence, arrested without warrants, and detained without charge or trial, and brutalized under Israeli custody. And this has been fully documented for 30 years now by primarily Israeli human rights organizations who can enter Israeli prisons. You have a wonderful journalist, John Lyon, whom I had the pleasure to meet when we were both... Hi, John. When we were both living in Jerusalem, and I've not seen him since, but he produced this wonderful documentary, I mean, wonderful, it's really heavy, called Stone Justice, 13 years ago, I believe. And I watched it recently, and I said, oh my God, it's still so current. And mass incarceration premised on the treatment of Palestinians as I said, as a security threat has been used. Why has been so widespread? Because it has been used to subjugate an entire population, depriving them of self-determination and enforcing racial domination and advancing territorial acquisition by force, because it's critical to understand that arrest and detention is functional to the expansion of the settlements. 95% of arrests take place within 1 kilometer from the colonies. While in prison confinement is the most acute form of deprivation of liberty imposed on the Palestinians under occupation, Palestinians are detained, as I was saying in the beginning, both behind bars and beyond bars, through physical confinement in their own territory, bureaucratic control made of permits to the Palestinians need to apply for, to build a house, to get married, to take residence, to move within and outside the territory, and omnipresent surveillance that is experimented on the Palestinians and sold abroad. Walls, checkpoints, alternative roads, bureaucratic barriers, surveillance technologies have been controlling and managing the Palestinian population for decades. And this is why eventually I concluded my second report calling the Palestinian territory a modern-day panopticon, a prison that is controlled from outside and from within. Wider carcerality is an essential feature of settler colonial regimes that have entrapped the natives, already dispossessed of their lands, into highly controlled and restricted reserves in order to ensure more and more land grabbing. Carcerality is another way of eliminating the natives to settle in their land, and this is still ongoing. It's an anachronistic enterprise, but still unfolding in the occupied Palestinian territory. But again, children are children, and today's children are tomorrow's adults. The necessity of reclaiming a more humane narrative is categorically imperative both to protect them and the society they will soon be part of. For many of them, Israel's settler colonial occupation manifests in a myriad of daily tragedies and traumatic experiences. It is the struggle of their parents who, after protracted legal battles to reclaim confiscated land, are forced to watch it being cultivated by settlers. It is the imposing 8-meter wall which separates families and communities and curtails livelihood and jobs. It's a father's heartbreak as he demolishes an unfinished home, left with only the mortgage to pay, just because he was unable to secure permits from the Israeli military. It's a depleted school, denied building permits, perpetually at risk of destruction by the military. It is empty classrooms, once filled with eager students, now resting in cemeteries or under the rubble. It's a brother hailed as a martyr in the refugee camp, but labeled as terrorist by the Israeli military, who later demolishes the family home. This is what I heard. This is what I saw from afar, from the dozen kids I interviewed over the summer to write this report. And this is the human story that I will continue to recount as an impartial witness amidst legal interpretation of promising norms and solutions. In conclusion, in today's political landscape marked by historical amnesia and outright political myopia, in which traditional media play a critical role, you decide the story to tell, I offer this reminder. The story of Palestine illustrates how international practice perpetuates injustice. ending the occupation and colonization is the imperative mandated by the international law simply to allow the other to live in freedom, safety, and dignity. This is what justice means in its simplest form, and this is what humanity means in its purest form. And in this rehumanization discourse, I convincingly include the Israelis, because like the Palestinians, they're part of an anachronistic settler colonial endeavor, of course, with unparalleled responsibilities and suffering. But ending Jewish-Israeli domination will be a rehumanizing act for them as well, because no one can oppress and brutalize the other without themselves experiencing a loss of humanity in the process. Thank you.
Thank you, Francesca. Let you get another big gulp of water there. You mentioned a couple of times what you described as the non-existent right of self-defence of Israel in the wake of those October 7 attacks. In your view, what action was Israel entitled to take after those attacks?
Yeah. Thank you, Tom. With your permission, I will clarify what is self-defense under international law, and so that everyone can understand, well, there is not such a thing that Israel could claim. So, in common language, self-defense might be understood as the right to protect oneself, which Israel clearly has. Israel has the sacrosanct right and duty to protect itself, its territory, its citizens. Although it tends to confuse a lot its own territory with the territory that it's trying to annex under occupation, and this is illegal. But however, Article 51 of the UN Charter that Israel has invoked is not just the right to protect itself. It's a self-defense under international law. It's a legal term of art and means the right to wage a war, which Israel doesn't have. And this is consolidated jurisprudence of the supreme judicial organ of the United Nations. I understand that the state practice might diverge, United States and Iraq, but the law remains the law, and this is what we should follow. So, the right of self-defense can be invoked when a state is threatened by another state, which is not the case. Israel has not claimed that that has been threatened by another state. It's been threatened by an armed group. Qualify it the way you want, but it's an armed group within the occupied territory. And frankly, even saying the war between Gaza and Israel is wrong, because Gaza is not a standalone entity, it's part of the occupied territory. But so, in particular, Israel cannot claim the right of self-defense against a threat that emanates from the territory it occupies, from a territory that is kept under belligerent occupation. And this is not only this exists in the jurisprudence of the ICJ in general, it's also been said in the case of the occupied Palestinian territory. So, going back to your question now, what Israel was allowed to do? To act to reestablish law and order, to repel the attack, neutralize whomever was carrying out the attacks, and then proceed with law and order measures, meaning not waging a war, but with law enforcement measures. One example, France was attacked by a terrorist group emanating from Belgium. Did France went and bombed entire residential areas in Belgium? No. So think of it. I know that we are used to think that the Palestinians can be bombed over and over, but it's wrong. And and the other thing that Israel had to do was to allow justice, the investigation of the prosecution of those responsible. I understand there have been missiles sent from Hamas-controlled Gaza Strip. But the thing is that the Gaza Strip has become the kingdom of Hamas, also thanks to the unilateral blockade that Israel has imposed over the Gaza Strip for 16 years, forcing 2.2 million people to live under Hamas. By the way, Hamas, until a couple of months ago, was defined by various ministers, including the Prime Minister of Israel, as an asset to Israel, while the PA was a liability. So we should, you don't have to believe me, listen to Israeli leaders and take them seriously. So yeah, what is being done is wrong. But let's even imagine that there was a right to wage a war against this part of the territory under belligerent occupation. There are still rules, distinction. You cannot target civilians under military attack. Excuse me, journalists to keep on inviting Israeli military personnel on your shows, and they tell you how much effort they are making to spare civilian life. 11,000 people killed is not enough to prove they are clearly incapable to respect the principle of distinction. How many more people need to die? And one example among many of the war crimes that I believe are being committed, the targeting of Jabalia refugee camps, where there was allegedly one, but let's assume that there was one Hamas operative that Israel wanted to target and kill. In order to kill that person, the life of hundreds of Palestinians, and we don't know how many, but probably a significant number of hostages has been endangered. 400 residents, the camp has been bombed, hundreds of deaths and hundreds of injured. So, this is clearly not respecting the principle of distinctions, the principle of proportionality, for which a military action needs to be proportionate to the military goal and the principle of precaution.
A lot to unpack there. I'll just ask one more before I go to my colleagues. When you say neutralise, when this attack is carried out and you've got Hamas leadership saying they want to do October 7 again and again and again, is it truly neutralising it if once they go across the border, Israel says, OK, well, the immediate threat has subsided?
Yes. When I hear Hamas leaders and when I hear Israeli leaders, particularly in these historical moments, they seem to me calling for the whole destruction of the other. But the difference is that unlike Hamas, what Israel is enforcing that reality. Hamas is not. And again, this is not to downplay, or this is not to condone, this is not to justify what Hamas is doing. This should all be, this is why I invoke the application of justice. But Israel has the capacity. When special rapporteurs have used the word genocide, there is a risk of genocide. We have looked not only at the genocidal intent, but based on previous practice, the reality on the ground, the reality on the ground is that there is a risk of genocide being committed by Israel and also the capacity to do that.
When you say they have, if they wanted to, it would probably be done, to be blunt about it. Yes, it's a dire situation for civilians, but Israel did say, civilians, please leave, this is where we're targeting. So that wasn't them actually targeting civilians at that point.
As my friend Daniel Levy told a BBC journalist, and I beg your pardon, I don't mean to be rude, but can you really keep a straight face as you ask me this question?
Well, if you're...
I will answer.
If you're asking civilians...
I will answer the question. Okay. There is nowhere to go. Because for those who are not familiar with the Gaza Strip, is a 300 square kilometers piece of land. Inhabited, it's the most crowded place on earth. And it has been, when I say carpet bombed, this is what 6,000 bombs per week do to an area which is so crowded. And this is why a war was not the response. But you know what, Tom? We already knew, because this is the sixth war that Israel has waged against Gaza. There was one in 2008, 2009, 2012, 2014, 2021, 2022. already 1,000 people had been killed, including 1,000 children. How did diminish the influence of Hamas over the people under blockade, and how did it diminished the capacity of harm Israelis? Palestinians have been left with nowhere to go, and all the more, all humanitarian actors involved, having a word to say on this, have said that an evacuation order imposing to 1.1 million the obligation to flee is absurd. It's unlawful.
Okay, I'm not meaning to interrupt. I'm just conscious I want to give my colleagues a go as well.
I don't
if I could get a next question out from Matthew Knott from the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age.
Thank you for your address today. You've said previously that it should ultimately be up to Palestinians to decide who governs in Gaza, and that Israel should be open to making a peace deal with Hamas. Given that Hamas leaders since October 7 have said repeatedly that they would like to repeat these attacks, is that really possible? Is Hamas really a potential partner for peace, or would the defeat or surrender of Hamas be part of any realistic peace agreement in Gaza?
I'm sorry, I cannot answer the question because you are basing yourself on something that has been reported, that it has been completely distorted. Sorry, I mean, you have some media who's really as manipulative as those in Italy. And I thought that No, I've said something else, that the military response cannot be war, must be peace. And the peace must be done with the Palestinians. But I mean, I'm also speaking of a non-legal peace, a peace, a reconciliation with the idea that Palestinians have same humanity and same entitled to rights, freedom, and dignity than the Israelis. So it was a very beautiful 35-minute conversation, and this is what the journalists got. I mean, I'm sorry, but this is not what I said. It's been completely distorted.
So are you saying that Hamas wouldn't have any potential role in a peace settlement after this conflict?
I don't know. It's not up to me to say. I'm a lawyer. I'm not a politician. I just say that what is to happen now is a ceasefire, an arms embargo toward all warring parties, Hamas and Israel, humanitarian corridors that do not become a way to forcible transfer anyone, setting all the hostages free, allowing them to return to their families unharmed, and also liberation of all the Palestinians who have been arbitrarily detained. Many of them are children. And then a serious plan to undo the occupation, to end the occupation. Because again, let's assume that Israel manages to kill all the 20,000 Hamas operatives that, I mean, I don't know, these are the figures that are being given. But still keeps the Palestinian under occupation. Another form of resistance like this will emerge.
So, Ms. Albanese, I know you say it's not up to you, you're a lawyer, but you know this issue intimately. Do you think it's feasible to see Hamas and Israel doing a peace deal, given what we know about Hamas? I mean, in its covenant, it says Israel will be destroyed.
Let's say that it was a difficult but lasting wedding until the 7th of October. I mean, Hamas has been there also because it was in Israel's interest to have Hamas there. Excuse me, Hamas would have not been the force that it is hadn't it been for Israel's continuous interference with the formation of a Palestinian polity. And Hamas was strongly subsidized and encouraged to expand in the Gaza Strip in order to provoke a crack, broaden a crack in the Palestinian liberation organizations led by Fatah. So I'm not saying that Hamas was a byproduct of Israel, but Israel supported it a lot, while the other movements were considered terrorist and then crushed.
Next question, Daniel Hurst from The Guardian.
Daniel Hurst from The Guardian. There's been a bit of debate in the last few days in Australia about the status of protection of hospitals. Hospitals in Gaza have obviously been the scene of extremely horrific scenes. Article 19 of one of the Geneva Conventions says the protection to which civilian hospitals are entitled shall not cease unless they're used to commit, outside their humanitarian duties, acts harmful to the enemy. I just want your legal perspective on whether, as it's been claimed, that Hamas has networks underneath some of these hospitals. This has been claimed. Does that remove the right to protect or the obligation to protect hospitals? At what threshold is there, at what threshold do those hospitals lose their protection?
Thank you. The threshold is very high because hospitals are particularly significant protected civilian objects. So the principle of distinction is that you not target a hospital. It's true. Article 19 that you quoted of the Geneva Convention establishes that the civilian status might be lost if there is there are military operations. But this doesn't mean bombing the hospital. It means giving the time to neutralize the military threat that comes from the hospital. And again, there are hundreds of UN staff and humanitarian officers, UN organization, WHO, ICRC, who have said, and frankly, this is on record, I mean, based on the experience from 5 commission of inquiries who have investigated previous situations where hospitals have been bombed because of alleged presence of Hamas operatives in them. There's never been such a case, although there are cases where Hamas has used civilian objects. But so, what does it mean that the hospital loses civilian status? As I said, it is to be proportional. The measures taken against the hospital needs to be proportional to neutralize the threat. And it cannot be bombed because it's going to destroy the capacity to provide humanitarian assistance to many, particularly at a moment like this one, because Al-Shifa Hospital has shut down, and now we don't even know where the deaths and the wounded will be taken.
Thank you.
As someone concerned for the plight of Palestinians, do you apportion some blame towards Hamas for using areas to militarise civilian areas?
Say it again? Sorry.
Well, if they're basing, say, military targets near hospitals or schools or civilian areas, do you blame Hamas for that as well?
Blame is not a legal language, so I don't blame anyone. I blame my children when they do something wrong. Other than that,
do you apportion? Well,
I condemn.
Okay.
I condemn. So yes, of course. The thing is, again, a highly densely populated area like Gaza, where even the rural area is restricted area and under under fire by Israel. I would like to see Gaza living in peace like the rest of the occupied territory and Israel, meaning living in peace. But again, this cannot happen until there is an illegal occupation imposed on the Palestinian people, which again, they will always, and I'm not justifying this, but this is a natural force of nature. They will resist their jailer. They will resist the people who keep them subjugated. By the way, I'm not necessarily someone concerned with the Palestinian plight. I'm concerned with human rights violations that take place in the occupied Palestinian territory and might affect Palestinians and Israelis. I'm very concerned with the fate, the well-being, and the future of both. I would really like this to be absorbed.
Next question from Noor Haider from the ABC.
Thank you for your speech, Noor Haider, ABC News. Human rights advocates have, for years, accused Israel of committing war crimes and violating international law with impunity. Many people are watching the death and destruction that's taking place in Gaza at the moment and are questioning whether there will ever be justice or accountability for the alleged crimes being committed. How can the paralysis that you spoke of earlier be ended? And do you believe existing international bodies like the ICC will be capable of bringing individuals to account for crimes committed before, on and after October 7?
Thank you. First of all, I'm grateful that in 2021 the United Nations appointed a commission of inquiry to investigate on international law violations, including crimes prosecutable under the Rome Statute, that have occurred and might still occur in the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem and Israel. So for me, I mean, I have a lot of hope and expectations on the work of this Commission of Inquiry, first and foremost. And of course, I have expectations, legitimate expectations, like any lawyer from the International Criminal Court, and also national courts, because universal jurisdictions is a reality in many countries. So yes, there should be justice, there should be accountability, for sure. But at the same time, the kind of justice that both Palestinians and Israelis deserve is broader than retributive justice, because eventually both of them need to find a way to live peacefully in that land. You had there was another part of your question, which is what can be done to overcome the impasse, which is mainly at the Security Council level. There are other measures. For example, there is a history of the General Assembly, for example, stepping in under the Resolution 377 of the General Assembly, United for Peace. So when the United Nations Security Council is paralyzed, well, the General Assembly can take over. I've not heard much discussion around it, and this is also something I'm considering to see whether it's worth recommending under the circumstances. But eventually, you know, international law is as powerful as the will of states to enforce it.
Thank you.
Next question comes from Alex Mitchell from AAP.
Hi, Alex Mitchell from AAP Newswire, and thank you very much for your address today. I did want to ask you about the role of the media in covering the situation, and you've obviously provided a bit of feedback so far. But I suppose, you touched on sort of the homework you feel journalists need to do. I suppose, what do you think are the main principles that have been lacking in the coverage so far? What role do you feel Islamophobia has played in the coverage, and I suppose in the wider global response?
Yeah, thank you. No, well, first of all, if I had to point to one thing in particular, is avoid dehumanizing the Palestinians, because there is a lot of this, and it's across the globe. Now, I'm not really talking of the Australian media, because I'm not that familiar with what you write. But in international media, there is a tendency to talk of Palestinian deaths as a tragedy, while Israeli deaths as crimes, and there is a lot of empathy and solidarity that goes to the Israelis when they are victims of violence, and rightly so. This is what we should do as human beings. But then this is lacking on the side of the Palestinians. And as I said, they're killed, they are blamed, and they are also smeared when they try to speak out. So get the facts straight. There are 11,000 people who have been killed, and I find often myself into TV programs where this is not discussed. It's better to think of things that sound as remote as ever, like the two-state solutions. Yes, of course, it's important to talk about the two-state solutions, but what about these 11,000 people who have been killed? And so you mentioned Islamophobia. I think that you have a point there, but what is really unfolding, it's something similar but different at the same time, and it's anti-Palestinian racism, which is a separate chapter of anti-Arabism. But you need to see that. The moment you see that, you cannot unsee it anymore, and you can recognize it in the work you do and in the work of others. And again, this is not to dehumanize the Israelis. Actually, what I try to say, it's recognizing the humanity of both, but silencing, excluding, erasing Palestinian voices, or stereotyping and defaming them, denying what they have suffered throughout history, which doesn't mean denying what others have suffered, but as some scholars very dear to me saying, it's about recognizing the trauma of the other, recognizing the pain of the other. So this, I mean, you can start from there.
The thing you always strive for in journalism is the truth. It's difficult in the fog of war, and I suppose the other thing that you alluded to earlier was proportionality, which feels impossible to judge sometimes because we don't know what the alleged target was and how many civilians might have been nearby in many circumstances. So is it also difficult to report on in that sense? Is it difficult for you to even know what the truth is when you've seen what's unfolded and if something was proportionate?
Yeah, this is why there are humanitarian people on the ground who can help you verify the facts. And then perhaps this is a good opportunity to trust the lawyers to give the legal analysis. I mean, not me, but you have brilliant lawyers in this country. So, I mean, you don't have to do all the analysis yourself. But there are legal experts who can tell you whether, from an international point of view, bombing churches, mosques, entire residential buildings, without a clear military objective. Voila, this is the other thing, that the objective of this campaign has been very opaque from the beginning. There was no real military target, because the target was eradicating Hamas. Yes, but what does it mean, eradicating Hamas? Because Hamas, like it or not, is a political reality. And what does it mean, eradicating it? What is happening is eradicating Hamas means as meant in 37 days, killing 11,000 people and burying under the rubble 3,000 more. So, I mean, no, this is not proportional, I can tell you.
I guess my question was more about, on each individual element, what's proportionate, because we don't know. I mean, anyone other than the IDF don't know what the targets were at that point, who was at risk. I might go to my colleague next, though, Sarah Tomevska from SBS.
Thank you for your speech. Sarah Tomevska from SBS. As we know, the Australian government's position is that Israel does have the right to defend itself. The Foreign Minister, Penny Wong, has described Hamas as a craven terrorist organisation that does embed itself in civilian infrastructure. But at the same time, she has said that Israel has an obligation to observe the rules of war and that the international community will not accept ongoing civilian deaths. Is this an appropriate response, or is this an example of what you've described as the paralysis of the international community?
No, this is what I call amnesia and myopia and living in an alternative reality. Because again, before the 7th of October, there was already plenty of evidence of violations of international law. And so let me just articulate some. Since 1967, Israel has built 300 colonies, which are a war crime in and of themselves, in the occupied Palestinian territory, violating Article 49 of the Geneva Convention, which prohibits the occupying power from transferring or encouraging, or supporting the transfer of its own civilian population into the occupied territory. This has meant establishing a system of structural violence made of dispossession, confiscation of land, and forcible displacement of the Palestinian. Forcible displacement, when it's widespread and systematic, is not just a war crime, it's a crime against humanity. And there has been, as I said, again, maintaining a system of arbitrary mass incarceration, mass arrest and detention amounts to violation of the right to fair trial that is also prosecutable to a scale that is prosecutable under the Rome Statute. And the list is long. So there were already crimes that were committed then, before the 7th of October. Gaza had been under blockade, which was a war crime, unlawful a collective punishment on the entire Palestinian population before. And there was wall-to-wall consensus that was illegal. So has any state, I'm not just blaming the West for once I'm not just criticizing the Western country, anyone taken measures, those afforded under the UN Charter, diplomatic, political and economic measures? No, so we are past this, and this mandate in particular for 25 years, for 20 years, my predecessors and now myself have said the West Bank, the Gaza Strip and East Jerusalem are becoming a powder keg. It will explode. It will explode. It has exploded.
Can I have one more? The Prime Minister yesterday in question time made a point of stressing that Australia is not complicit in what is unfolding in Gaza. What is your response to that?
I've not investigated that. I have no element to comment on that, but I understand, and I've tried to get some figures that I've not had as of yet, just out of curiosity, to understand what is the capacity and the content of military exports from Australia to the warring parties. I mean, this could be understood as being responsible for what's happening. I mean, many have called for an arms embargo, as it happens under these circumstances when serious violations of international law and crimes are being committed. So this is something on which you, journalists, may want to insist.
Got a question from... Got a question from an interested viewer, Mark Kenny of the ANU and Canberra Times. I think you alluded to this before when you mentioned powder keg, but he asks, has the severity of this conflict radicalised ordinary Palestinians and made a possible two-state solution even more unlikely, and would a more moderate Israeli government improve that?
The only thing I can say, based on my experiences, and not just in Palestine or in occupied Palestinian territory or Israel, and it's a more broader sense, is that violence begets violence. And so I don't think that there is evidence to say that the violence that Israel has imposed on the Palestinians has really radicalized the Palestinians. I'm still mesmerized at what Chris Edges called the miracle of kindness that the Palestinians still carry through and through. So I don't know if it will radicalize them, but it's leaving them without hope. And if I look at it from the perspective of children, this is so unfair, because it's not only destroying their present, but it's incapacitating them in the possibility to envisage and to enjoy a future.
Next question from Daniel Hurst again from The Guardian.
Daniel Hurst again from The Guardian. I get a second go. You've made a very clear pitch about avoiding dehumanising anyone in this particular debate, Palestinians and Israelis. I couldn't help but being tripped up by the very ending of your speech, where you said that ending Jewish-Israeli domination would be rehumanising acts for them as well. I just want to ask whether that sort of comment is helpful in the current climate, talking about ending Jewish-Israeli domination.
Yeah. Not sure what it's helpful. I wonder whether it's helpful to pretend that apartheid doesn't exist, because this is what we are talking about. I said domination, not existence. Now, if we are unable to envisage Jewish Israelis living without, being on top of the other, I think this is a problem. And this is where we need to correct our own approach to the other. Because how would you expect the Palestinians to want to live subjugated? I mean, 1 or 10 or 50 more years. No, I mean, there shouldn't be domination. But particularly, let me say, it has a very specific meaning in the occupied Palestinian territory, where Israel dominates without any legal justification or basis. The occupation is illegal. It's unlawful because it operates against and outside of everything that is permitted under international law, because it's been a vehicle to colonize the land. It serves no military necessity, and it's also apartheid by default, because having civilian law imposed on, applied to the settlers, who shouldn't be there in the first place, which doesn't mean that a two-state solution would translate into the uprooting of them. No, I'm not calling for that, but I'm just saying that the occupation must end. The exploitation of Palestinian land and resources must end, and then it's up to the Palestinians and the Israelis to see how to live together in whatever forms of state they can envisage. It's not up to us. But for me, it's really about basic application of international law.
You've applied it to that particular context, but you don't think the word domination has a wider connotation outside that context?
What do you mean?
Talking about Israeli Jewish domination.
Meaning, are you asking me in Israel?
Well, the phrase jumped out at me at the end of your speech, and I'm just wondering if the trope of domination is
No,
something...
it's not a trope, it's really real. So it seems not to understand what I'm saying. There is an apartheid regime. No, I'm serious. There is an apartheid regime. It's domination. This is not a trope. This is international law. I encourage you to read the Apartheid Convention, because it talks about racial domination. And this is what I'm talking about. It might be a trope into the way you interpret it. But I'm using domination in a strictly legal sense.
Thank you very much for answering my questions.
I think we've got, yes, one more question from Noor Hayder from the ABC.
Just another question. I'm curious to know whether, as part of your tour, you've approached or sought a meeting with the federal government, and if not, can I get your response to those who argue, including the Australian government, that the United Nations has an inherent anti-Israel bias?
Does the Australian government say that? I'm appalled. No, I don't think there is an anti-Israeli bias. Let's look at the reality. It's true. In my interactions with the Israelis, who are not necessarily, and I fully appreciate, there is such a level of manipulation of the information. So many Israelis do not tend to see the United Nations as a system naturally friendly. But the thing is that there has been such an impasse at the UN Security Council level, because the Security Council is eventually the main body responsible in the UN system to take measures to correct, to address the threats to peace and security, to take measures to ensure the maintenance of peace and security, and ending the occupation, as the Security Council had recommended already, or had established already in November 1967. This was a determination of the way forward, a road to peace and the occupation. It has not been done, and then there has been the paralysis of the UN system. Because of the incapacity of the system to redress that, because of the US veto within the UN Security Council, other bodies which are more democratic, more representatives, where there is no veto power, like the General Assembly and the Human Rights Council, have intervened in order to bring correctives. But I don't think that this is necessarily a bias against Israel. Let's respect international law, and I'm sure that the United Nations will be the happiest not to deal with Israel and the occupied Palestinian territory anymore.
And on the question of whether you've sought a meeting with the federal government, the Prime Minister or the Foreign Minister?
Yeah, of course. And we have sought meetings with the Minister of Foreign Affairs. We will meet someone else, because I understand she's very busy.
Thank you.
The year 2022 had 15 UN resolutions that were criticising Israel and 13 against other countries around the world. Does that seem disproportionate given how many humanitarian sort of crises have been going on at that time, including Russia and Ukraine? In terms of that Israel bias?
Sorry, Tom. Can you...
15 resolutions were passed by the UN General Assembly criticising Israel specifically, 13 criticised countries around the world, so 6 against Russia. So to that Israel bias, does that seem disproportionate, so many against Israel?
I'm not good in math. But when did the occupation of Ukraine, portions of Ukraine started?
Well before 2022.
Yeah, I think 2016. So how many resolutions have been passed since 2016? You said 15 resolutions on Russia?
Well, the point is 13 for
I know
any
what's
country.
your point.
Yeah,
Look at the maths.
Well, I said 6 for Russia, but 13 of any country around the world versus 15
you
against
mentioned
Israel.
Russia. You mentioned Well, there are not many countries in the world which have this situation.
My question is around that being proportionate.
No, but it's not any country. Here we are not talking. My mandate is not to talk about the violations that Israel commits against its own citizens. I'm responsible to look at the violations that Israel commits against a population which it maintains under belligerent occupation. There are not many situations like this in the world. So I challenge you on that. The point is how, probably another question could be, and again, I think that on the maths, it wouldn't look that disproportionate if since 2006 there was that level of resolutions passed on Russia, Ukraine, and look at the resolutions that the Security Council has passed on the occupied Palestinian territory. Probably 70 have been tabled. Half of them have been vetoed by the Security Council. So this is something we should be talking about, the veto power.
We're going to leave it there. Francesca Albanese, much appreciate your speech. Here as well, we've got a club membership as a thank you as well. Thank you very much. The club membership for the Press Club if you ever managed to get back. So.